Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. It's been a while since I've been recording between the marathon, going to weddings and things like that. Definitely been, a little bit, behind the eight ball in terms of recording, but I'm back. I'm ready to go, and I am ready to talk about this chaotic week 13. And there's just so much to take in, but, I figured, kind of like Matt Berry's show, I figured it would be easiest to go chronological order. So, with that said, the first obvious general discussion would be the Indiana Ohio State game, and in particular, is Indiana still a playoff team after this Ohio State loss? Now there's a couple angles that you can take this from. If we're talking about specifically about the game versus Ohio State this weekend, there are a couple of general takeaways. I'd say first and foremost, Will Howard is, I would argue, he has proven to be an upgrade compared to Colin McCord. I would argue that in many ways they both have very similar skill sets. But what sets apart Will Howard from Kyle McCord in the sense that he is more reliable. And what I mean by more reliable is particularly his decision making and being able to find those particular receivers, in those clutch moments and those third down situations where, when you're having that sort of leadership capability, those are kind of the differences between, people who have relatively similar skill sets and relatively similar talents, but you can see the progression and the difference throughout the college football season, and that was on full display versus Indiana this week. Because when I was first watching this game, and I saw that Ohio State scored the first touchdown, and I said, hey, no shit, they're probably gonna go down and score. And then once in Indiana did the same thing, I was like, man, this would be a really intriguing shootout, especially, when Kirk Signetti, I mean, he's a man of few words. He's, always pretty bold with his press conferences. And that's the one thing I admire about him. He, you can criticize him. You can say all the things you know, that he does, but at the end of the day, he typically backs them up. And overall, in terms of this game, yes, Will Howard was kind of the unsung hero in a sense. I mean, statistically speaking, it wasn't anything that really jumped off the page too much. However, he did just enough for them to, be able to catapult themselves and, further distinguish themselves and be in the Big Ten title race versus Oregon, which I am really excited for, especially, how that last game went down to the final wire, and how Will Howard kind of had that, I guess you can call it a blunder, but at the same time, I mean, Oregon clearly had the game won anyway. But I think that's one of those games that's definitely been kind of on Will Howard's calendar, and it definitely makes for a good story too. Because at the end of the day, no matter what Ryan Day does, he's always going to be under a ton of pressure. And you hear it from Ohio State fans every year, be like, okay, is this going to be the year? Is this going to be the year? And something always ends up happening. And on College Game Day too, a lot of people, a couple of the analysts, particularly Lee Corso, I mean, that's different because he coached Indiana, and Desmond Howard both picked Indiana, which I thought was kind of intriguing because, did I think Indiana had a chance to beat them? I mean, yeah. I think everybody to some degree wants the sort of Cinderella story, as Jess Sims called it, but at the same time, too, at least on paper, Ohio State has so much more talent than Indiana to the point where it really was overwhelming. And I've said this on this show multiple times, even though I grew up in South Jersey and, remember watching Penn State and Pittsburgh games on TV all the time. But at the same time, my unbiased take would be that I still think Ohio State is the most talented team in the country. And I still stand by that, especially when you saw it on display, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. Now, Curtis Rourke deserves a lot of credit for what he's done this year. And Kirk Signetti, obviously, he's got all the praise in the world for, bringing in the right transfers, bringing in the right identity, and bringing in that confidence that's really kind of been missing from Indiana for, let's just say the past, 30 seasons really. And obviously, they fired Tom Allen and he went on to be Penn State's defensive coordinator. But as I was watching this game, I mean, you can definitely argue that this game really wasn't as lopsided, I guess you can say, too, because to some degree, obviously Ohio State was running the score up a little bit, and but at the same time too, it goes back to my original point of, at the end of the day, Ohio State is simply a more talented team. And it's not that Indiana isn't a good team. It's just that at this point in time, Oregon and Ohio State and Penn State, they're just simply on a different tier compared to Indiana. And it definitely makes you think of the hypothetical too. Could Indiana beat Penn State, or are they a better team right now? And you can look at that from two different angles. I mean, I think Indiana is certainly, I would argue, more explosive than Penn State to some degree, but it goes back to my original point with Ohio State. Penn State is the more talented football team, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, and that's a large and I would argue that's really the main reason why Ohio State was able to beat Indiana, was because their cornerbacks and their secondary. I mean, they're so aggressive in terms of being able to not get much separation. And in many ways, there's a lot of parallels between this game versus Penn State. And in the sense of Indiana's receivers weren't really able to get a lot of separation. Now, granted, I mean, when they were in some zone reads, and Curtis Rourke was able to kind of find the right man in those sort of soft coverages, but outside of that, it definitely was difficult for Indiana's offense to get going to, and that showed this weekend as Ohio State, did their thing and is looking to be cruising versus Oregon going to the Big Ten championship game, which, leads me to my general conversation of, is Indiana still a playoff team? And, we can talk about Indiana's merits. I mean, obviously 108th in the country in terms of, difficulty of schedule. The teams after them would be North Carolina, who's 93. Then you have Notre Dame, who's about 87. And there's one other team, I believe it's UCal. Don't quote me on that. But I know the other two are definitely North Carolina and Notre Dame. But there's definitely a big divide between Indiana's strength of schedule versus, let's say, a Notre Dame or Ohio State, or whoever else you want to compare them to. And even if you look at the ticker there, I mean, they definitely struggled versus Michigan a little bit, to the degree that defensive line definitely was able to kind of, I wouldn't say take over, but they certainly disrupted the game, in the sense that Indiana definitely had some struggles, and they definitely had to make some adjustments going into that second half, but they did just enough to win the game. And at the end of the day, that's what's important in college football. And I say it over and over again, it's about the week-to-week preparation, which I will get to another episode, because if you heard Lane Kiffin's comments as well as Mike Elko's comments, some head coaches certainly don't look at it that way, but that's for another video. But when you look at the ticker below, I mean, really the two most impressive wins that they have are Nebraska and Michigan, who neither of them were ranked at the time. So, I mean, yes, it was 56-7 versus Nebraska, and nobody was expecting it to be that dominant of a win. And, I was certainly taken aback too, saying like, hey, maybe this Indiana team is legit, but it goes to show that it's in some ways it's the same sort of narrative, in the sense that, Penn State's not getting over the hump. And, regardless of what happens to, Indiana has superseded expectations by a mile. I mean, I think at best, Indiana, the expectations for them were to be dead last in the Big Ten, besides Purdue, and, perhaps win, somewhere between 2 and 4 games. So for them to go from 2 to 4 games to presumably being 11-1 if they beat 1-10 Purdue, I mean, that's pretty spectacular, regardless of if they are one and done in the playoffs. But in terms of their playoff picture, they got a lot of help this weekend. I would I even want to throw out the word lucky, perhaps, but they got lucky in the sense of, hey, Alabama got whooped by, I'll say whooped by Oklahoma, particularly Jalen Milroe, just unable to get anything going on the offensive side of the ball. And, for the most part, Ryan Williams, yes, he had some open spots, but that really wasn't anything spectacular. And then obviously Ole Miss going down versus Florida, which I'll also cover in another episode. But when you have those things kind of all encompassing all together, it almost overrides Indiana's loss, because when I saw that Indiana was pretty much getting whooped by Ohio State, and as I was watching throughout the day, my first thought to myself is that the big storyline was going to be Ohio State beating Indiana. But as you go through the week, I mean, you can even say to yourself, hey, Boise State really struggled versus Wyoming, but they were able to find a way to come after it. And when you have the loss against Alabama and you have the loss of Ole Miss, their storyline or their loss really isn't being as maybe not being as discussed, but it's not it's a storyline that other people can not think about as much because you have those two other, bigger SEC situations that people can talk about too. And, I've been a vocal advocate of this and I will still double down on this. I don't care who wants to comment, who wants to discuss this with me, but I've said it consistently. Unless you are a conference loser, conference championship loser, no football team has any business of being in the college football playoff with 3 losses. And when you look at Alabama and you look at Ole Miss, I mean they're in terms of a playoff picture, yes, they're absolutely done. But I think because of those 2 losses, and you look at Indiana's full resume, I mean, yes, I talked about a couple seconds ago that they definitely were not impressive in terms of strength of schedule, but they've dominated. They've dominated everybody outside of Michigan. And, yes, Maryland's in their conference, Northwestern's in their conference, Nebraska's in their conference. I think they played UCLA, Washington. And, when you add all those teams up, conference play has to matter. And, and how much you win by matters. And, I can even sit on the bottom of the ticker now, Michigan State too. But nevertheless, at the moment, I would still double down and say that they deserve to be a playoff team. Yes, they definitely got some help with the SEC too, but I just have trouble imagining how Indiana doesn't get in it because, yes, there is a hypothetical scenario of Miami and SMU possibly, being 2 teams who would get in, but I don't know how you would be able to put SMU, a 2-loss SMU team in over Miami, especially if Miami were to, whoop SMU too, because at the moment, the first 2 teams that are out are Tennessee and SMU. So, but at the same time too, Texas A&M also lost as well. So if you swap Alabama and Ole Miss with SMU and Tennessee, it definitely adds another conversation too. And yes, Indiana is probably going to be losing some brownie points. I don't know if they're necessarily going to have a home game, but they definitely still deserve to be a playoff team. And when you look at this resume as a whole, they certainly are deserving of it. Do I think they're going to get very far? I'd be a little skeptical of that. However, when you look at their full resume and you look at what else has happened in college football, they definitely deserve to be in it. And granted, did they have their best game versus Ohio State? No, but for a team that's gone, if we give them Purdue the win, going 11-1, being undefeated in conference play outside of Ohio State, and winning by such a large majority, and also being explosive in offense, being able to get things going, both passing and running the ball, as well as having a defense, it's definitely a recipe for a playoff berth. And I definitely would be fascinated to see who they end up playing in the first round, because there's a lot of intriguing matchups, especially if an SEC team were to travel to a Big Ten opponent.